Thank you very much, Gorka. Nothing much to add on my side. As for presentation, I think we pretty much all know each other. And firstly, thank you to the University of Deusto. I think it's really, for me, a treat to have our guests, particularly because I'm going to speak briefly about an aspect of my PhD research, which focuses on one particular minority that Roberta has also mentioned a number of times. So I think it does fit pretty well. And it will touch on a number of aspects that actually have been already mentioned this morning. So actually I will pick up on Eduardo's also provocation of deterritorializing power politics. And in a way, I'm also very glad, apart from having Roberta and getting her feedback, that her presentation really already touched on a number of things that I will therefore be able to skip and avoid repeating a number of things on integration in particular. So focusing more on the for whom without really going into the specifics of the integration indicators. So why, firstly, why this special minority or peculiar minority in many ways? And how I'm interested in looking at how it has been framed, what identity we're talking about. We're talking about cultural identity of the Roma minority. And but the departing point is that the issue of exclusion and discrimination of minorities that are both culturally and or ethnically different from the majority and that find themselves in a situation of socioeconomic marginalization is certainly not new, but that it has increased in the past few decades, and that it is particularly stark in the case of the Roma minority. This is particularly true as with the post-Cold War. We have seen that in Central and Eastern European countries, Roma minorities that were typically occupying the sort of low-scale labor market have found themselves in an increasingly vulnerable situation of unemployment, of discrimination, etc. So there has been, in a way, when let's say the core, it speaks to the title of this whole workshop day, which is distinguishing between new and old minorities, and how the policies that have been developed and are being developed and implemented now at the European level speak about a minority without necessarily making distinctions in regards to citizenship, nationality, whether we're talking about migrants, refugees, stateless people, and what kind of implications that has and will have in terms of integration on the different levels that Roberta previously mentioned, of identification, cultural, etc. So this was towards the end of the 90s, after the Copenhagen criteria, when the European Commission assessed the candidate countries' progress in complying with the criteria, that overall there had been a sort of satisfactory compliance with integration, except for the situation of the Roma minority in a number of applicant countries, which gives cause to concern. This, however, is by no means an exclusive concern of Central and Eastern European countries. For instance, the Council of Europe report that just came out 1 month ago has, and this has been going on for a number of years at this point, has a specific section on Roma discrimination. And it's the only ethnic minority that has its own special section in the report. And, okay. So this has, in the last decade especially, even though it has started to some extent earlier, brought to a number of policies, strategies, and recommendations that have started initially from the countries that were more concerned because of a larger Roma demographic, but also now has taken really a European dimension. So apart from the Decade for Roma Inclusion, initially developed by 10 countries, there has been in 2008 a European platform for Roma inclusion, Strasbourg Declaration on the Roma, which has brought the creation of a special representative of Roma issues. And now in this, particularly in this programming period by the European Union, 2014-2020, there has been an important amount of the social funds that have been earmarked, especially for poverty eradication, with a special mention for the Roma. So there has been, and I think it's significant because in an environment in which it's the first time that the European budget overall has been reduced, this particular resources have gone from 17% to 20% of the ESF. And let's say the most important, or what is constituting now the backbone of the general Roma strategy at the European level is what has been passed with our communication in 2011 called the EU Framework for National Roma Integration Strategies, in which 26 countries have drafted strategies for Roma integration. And here is I think the two big issues come into place. Who are Roma and what is integration? So on the one hand, since this morning we've focused on integration, I will stay a little bit more with the target group, because I think it's interesting and to some extent worrisome, the fact that all this political energy and funding is being invested towards the integration of someone who we don't have a target group. I mean, this is the best estimates that we have of the Council of Europe that have a margin of error of 2 million. So it becomes a bit difficult to integrate someone who is territorially dispersed, not identified, as Roberta mentioned this morning, often very reticent to declaring themselves as Roma for fear of discrimination. And so I will focus a little bit on that. And of course, this has some serious implication as how we go about measuring integration as well. So who belongs to this target group? And who do we mean by Roma? And has this concept changed over time or not? Because this is also, and do we mean the same thing at the European level, at the national level, at the local level? I started by looking at generally what do we use as a basis for identity and identifications, not for Roma, for minority, but also for majority populations. So one criteria could be location, and this is a fairly easy one in the case of the Roma, because, I mean, there definitely is no territorial claim whatsoever in Europe. And while there is a lack of both geographical basis and of a kin state, there has been in 2003 at the 5th Romani World Congress an attempt, I mean, there was a declaration of non-territorial nation, which has not brought about much change, but there has been a number of, in the world, Romani Congresses attempts to unify Romani language and to kind of move towards some model of non-territorial autonomy that could claim some recognition or rights that are currently lacking. In terms of citizenship, it's a minority that is very scattered. So there is no link. It's definitely not a population that can be identified by any specific citizenship. But on the other hand, there have been some, like in the recent years, with this politicization of Roma identity, some initiatives of issuing some Roma passports from NGOs. And usually this has been done to prove the Roma identity, in the case to support asylum claims. And in some countries in Europe which recognize Roma as a national category, for instance in Hungary, if you want to vote for the Roma parliament, then you need to be registered in the Roma electoral list, which is a separate list, and you have to choose. So either you vote for the Hungarian elections or for the Roma parliament. And also race, ethnicity. In Europe, we prefer usually to reuse ethnicity. But usually the claim is that this is very clearly an ethnic minority, which is true to some extent, but to what extent ethnicity is constructed also plays a role, in the sense that this is Post, she was elected last week as a member of the European Parliament in Sweden with the Feminist Party, I believe. But anyway, it's this case of the blonde, blue-eyed, typical, not fitting the stereotype of what ethnicity and Roma should be. So also, I'm sure we've heard of the number of scandals that have going on over the last year in Greece, Ireland, etc., on a number of Roma parents being accused of abducting children simply because they did not correspond to what the stereotype is. And then we come to what fits more here and what I'm more interested in, which is the cultural and self-identification part. So as Eduardo said this morning, usually when we think of culture, there are too many components of language and religion. And in terms of language, we were speaking with Renee over lunch that there's no definitely it cannot be taken as a core of Roma identity in the sense that it's spoken by a minority of Roma people and characterized by dozens of dialects, many of which are mutually unintelligible. Now, this, of course, can be questioned because one could claim that the Basque language is in a similar situation. But for this particular issue, I think it's also a combination of the lack of this territorial component with this scattered issues. And in terms of religion, different communities follow different religions, and there is definitely no link to one affiliation. And in terms of cultural practices, some have tried, from an anthropological perspective, to kind of bring up a number of practices that are definitely distinctive to the Roma. But there are a number of issues there in the sense that, on the one hand, they're not uniform, and most of them are archaic and not necessarily practiced. And usually the people that bring them up do so in order to show how these are absolutely in contrast with European values or certain human rights. So here we go into the whole gender dimension of certain cultural practices. So to sort of like sum it up, I think in the literature what we find is that definitely there's nobody denying Roma identity as such, but it's very difficult to put the finger on it. And while I think the most sensible criteria would be that of self-identification, it becomes very problematic for a population that has been stigmatized historically. So in terms of legal documents and EU policies, the definition that has been used and that is used by the European Commission and by the Council of Europe refers to Roma as an umbrella, which includes groups of people who have more or less similar cultural characteristics, whether sedentary or not. So the wide majority of the Roma population is currently sedentary, but the fact that it is identified by more or less similar cultural characteristics do not necessarily help us if what we are trying to do here is link certain minority characteristics to minority rights and protection. Whereas the UNDP, on the same year, practically stated that it's not just an umbrella term encompassing different subgroups, but it is also a complex contract comprised of a myriad of diverse characteristics, and that different sides involved use the terms as an intellectual shortcut, ascribing to it different meaning. So depending on which organization or Roma expert or community is using the term, it might refer to different things. And then the EU platform for Roma inclusion includes also the Ashkali, so it added also the history of persistent marginalization as one of the functional attributes, and it also makes explicit that the term Roma is used in the context of a policy document dealing with issues of social exclusion and discrimination, and not with specific issues of cultural identity. And I think this is the key gap. We have a problem, so is this a minority that is being identified in cultural terms or in terms of social exclusion and poverty and class? So, and also which community? Is it the historical, because René has spoken of the Jews at one point as a historical minority in Europe. And historically we find traces, the first Roma settlements in Europe go back, date around the 12th century. So by all means, this is considered a historical, an old minority. But then there is two main, I would say, waves of migration. One with the Balkan War. So there are a number of people that moved because of that, and coupled also with the consequence of redrawing of borders, of discriminations, of unemployment, etc. And then the directive from 2004 on the freedom of movement. So a number of European citizens, or not, that have relocated from Central and Eastern European countries to Western countries. So for instance, in Italy, currently, when Italy was asked to draft the national strategy on Roma integration, this means addressing issues of Roma Italian citizens, which represent more or less 50% of the target population we're talking about. Then there are European citizens, mainly from Romania and Bulgaria, but not only. Then there are like third country nationals, a lot of them from the Balkans, and then there are stateless people that Roberto was also mentioning. That's not a huge population in Italy, but the almost totality of stateless people that currently reside in Italy are Roma. So we have 4 different kind of legal situations, and these are not so clear-cut as it could seem. So just a very brief anecdote, for instance, in Tuscany, a few months ago, when the current prime minister decided to run and to get involved in national politics as part of the political campaign, he thought it would be a good move to dismantle one of the camps that is in the outskirts of Florence. So this is what happened, but not being sure exactly how to address where to relocate these people, somebody thought, oh, it could be some of these people are from Kosovo and Serbia. Maybe they could be eligible for refugee status. So let's look into that. So that's what happened, and right now there's a number of people that actually have obtained refugee status 15 or 20 years after. So they have moved from being in a sort of illegal camp with limbo status to now being relocated in what are called SPRARs, because this goes under the Ministry of Interior that is handling refugees, which is an absurd situation under many aspects. But it's really symptomatic, I think, of a kind of population that the Italian government in particular, but not only, has absolutely no clue of where to fit and how to handle. And we're talking in this case of, in the Italian case, it's 0.2% of the population. I mean, higher estimates say 200,000 people, but probably it's less than that. So it's not a number, it's not a question of numbers, and it's not a question of a population that represents a threat towards the government in terms of having territorial claims. Not at all. So the issue of the new and old Roma minorities, I think, is very telling and should be looked into, because this is a quote from Nicola Gheorghe, who died last year. He was a very prominent Roma intellectual and human rights activist, who his main complaint was, and he was one of the people consulted in drafting these national strategies, but the argument was that the irony of it is that the Roma were put on the agenda because of migration, but migration isn't dealt with in the strategy. So there is the general feeling that at a European policy level, Roma discrimination is nothing particularly new. But because of migration and because of the demographics, it has suddenly been put on the agenda, in that the way these strategies have been drafted and structured address kind of the hard integration issues of housing, health, education, and employment. But the anti-discrimination dimension is very weak, and it was put transversely there, but is not really explicitly addressed. And the migration dimension is also not addressed in the slightest. And so this has to do just with how recent it is to talk of Roma identity, thanks, in terms of cultural identity. And I'm not sure, and actually I would be curious to open it up later and hear different opinions, whether different kind of populations can be compared in the first place. Because not only do we have the issue of these new minorities coming from Central and Eastern Europe towards Western Europe, and of the, let's say, oldest minorities, but also this issue of a minority of the minority that is still nomadic, and then the great majority of Roma which are not. But then the perception, the identity that is associated to the Roma at this point is very much tied to this minority of the minority. So in a way, when, and not only from the side of stigmatizing or discriminating, but in terms of protection, this was a number of cases in the UK, for instance, where the kind of discovery of Roma cultural identity by the Court of Strasbourg firstly hinged on a very stereotyped conception of Roma. So this was rooted in, on the one hand, nomadism, and on the other hand, on the conceptualization of Roma as a group that is subject to poverty and exclusion. So rather than as an ethnically, culturally defined people. So when it is defined as a cultural minority, this has to do mainly with the nomadic dimension. And when it is not, it is almost exclusively an excluded and vulnerable group, which is of course true. But if that becomes the main identity marker, then addressing identity becomes an issue of doing away with identity. So as Roberta was saying again this morning, this has led to policies that can seem contradictory, and I think don't necessarily need to be so. I mean, if they are implemented correctly, it has been a huge effort, and a new and I think very courageous one, to draft a policy that is explicit but not exclusive, in the sense that obviously we need to deal with a minority that has issues that certainly have a cultural peculiar dimension, but mostly have to do with marginalization that is social and economic at base. So these are the 10 common basic principles, and I just wanted to kind of put a little bit of the focus on the third and fourth point, because on the one hand, one of the general principles is intercultural approach, and the other is aiming for the mainstream. So also we can speak later of what this means and how these two can complement each other or not, or conflict. And regarding the policies and assessment and how the monitoring and evaluation is being thought of and put into place, it's so far very weak. And these are policies that have been approved a couple years ago, and now they are in the process of being implemented. And I think it's interesting to see what a number of different countries mean for integration and how they have implemented these policies. Now, I know I'm running late on time, so I leave this, if anybody's curious, for later. And these are the main challenges that were outlined by the State of Democracy, Human Rights, and the Rule of Law in Europe report that just came out. So the main problems, and this is a very synthetic overview actually of what is there, is that Roma integration is not seen as beneficial for all of society. So on the one hand, on paper, there are all these policies, but the huge elephant in the room is still the lack of political will. So on what kind of options or solution could be offered to this, there's a range of possibilities, and none of them is straightforward or easily implemented. And then on the lack of recognition of anti-Gypsyism as racism, so the typical discourse of I am not racist, but the Roma, and the lack of will and or capacity nationally and locally to use available resources. So all this, right now it's like 16 billion euros more or less for a 7-year period that has been allocated by the European Union to this specific issue. And Romania, for instance, was able to absorb less than 7% of it in the past programming period. So this is a whole other Pandora box in and of itself. And I will just leave it at that for now and pass it on to Catalina.